he has left. He raised his hand. Maybe Sean wants to just very quickly explain why I have been given the award. When you get it, you sort of feel a little unsure, but certainly it has to do with fortitude given the situation. But if Sean might want to give a minute or two to just...
It's all right, we'll come back to Sean later. No, we'll come back to him. You keep talking.
Well, so that's it. The ceremony will take place in November in New York. I'm still not sure if I'll be able to travel, although the literary team has lifted the ban last June. Now I'm facing with new charges.
ก็เดี๋ยวเดือนพฤศจิกายนนะคะจะเป็นเวลาที่คุณประวิตรจะได้เดินทางไปรับรางวัลแต่ว่าตอนนี้ก็ไม่แน่ใจว่าจะได้ไปไหมเพราะว่าเพิ่งจะได้คดีใหม่มา
police investigator at the Technology Crimes Suppression Division, which is at the government complex building in Jangwatana Road. So the award is a boost, but at the same time, it attracts more attention. I got hate speech coming in, particularly on Twitter, and the society is so divisive, and that's the sort of situations you have to
หลังจากได้รับรางวัลนะคะก็มีคนเข้ามาด่าบ้างเหมือนกันใน
Twitter. Do you regard yourself as an activist journalist? Do you set out to be provocative, to push the envelope, or do you just do a day's work on whatever subject comes up?
I'm primarily a journalist. The first, the two detentions that took place was unprovoked, as in I wasn't on the streets or tweeting, calling them to detain me. I think the first detention, which lasted for a week, we were kept in a camp in Ratchaburi province, took place because I wrote an instant criticism against martial law, which was imposed 2 days before the coup, if you recall. Yeah. And it just happened that it came out on the International New York Times on the day of the coup.
ครั้งแรกที่ถูกจับไปปรับทัศนคติที่ราชบุรีเป็นเวลา1 เดือน1 สัปดาห์นะคะก็เพราะว่ามีการทวิตเตอร์นะคะข้อความไม่เห็นด้วยกับการประกาศกฎอัยการศึกค่ะ
Interviewing me, I was spending a good amount of time here, and whenever they asked about Prayut, I would always say, Prayut. The question is, what kind of man or person is Prayut? And I always say, look, Prayut said publicly many times as army chief that he will not stage any coup, and of course he staged the coup. So you could only read it 2 ways: either he changed his mind abruptly or he lied. Either way, Prayut is not a reliable person, and I think it must have been watching Al Jazeera, the BBC, and other. And so on the following day, there was this order read on television and radio and on all the stations summoning me to be detained. Okay. Second time, it was about Twitter. I tweeted saying that to me, and that was a year after. It happened in September 2015. I simply tweeted, both in Thai and English, of course, saying something like, to me, General Prayut was no longer an army general the day he staged the coup, and it got them really offended because when they took me in, before they would blindfolded me, I went through 6 hours of interrogations by the military, and they reminded me that only His Majesty could bestow or remove the ranking of an army at a general.
ครั้งที่2ก็คือที่ประวิตรไปวิจารณ์ว่าตอนที่ประยุทธ์ทำรัฐประหารเนี่ยไม่ได้ถือว่าเป็นผบ.ทบ.แล้วก็ได้ทราบว่าเขาโกรธมากเลยถูกจับปรับทัศนคติครั้งหนึ่ง
inside an unspecified van which doesn't look official at all. So that reminds me of East Germany, that's what they do back in those days. So my answer is no. I only express myself, but of course at this special time, let me just be very clear. We can't just report. We have to defend whatever freedom of speech and freedom of expression, press freedoms that we have left. If you give in and start treating this
ที่ประวิตรก็บอกว่าในเวลาแบบนี้เนี่ยเราไม่สามารถจะแค่รายงานข่าวเฉยๆแต่เราจะต้องลุกขึ้นมาปกป้องสิทธิเสรีภาพในการแสดงความคิดเห็นด้วย
I repeatedly call this regime illegitimate, and I I suspect it has to do with some of my posting on Facebook that got myself in trouble yesterday may have something to do with that. You cannot treat this regime as a normal administration. So that is the stance. You know, well, other media, okay, I get that point. They just report about what's happening at the government house as normal.
ก็พี่ประวิตรก็มีท่าทีที่ต่อต้านอำนาจเผด็จการมาโดยตลอดในขณะที่สื่ออื่นส่วนใหญ่ก็ยังคงรายงานกันไปตามปกติ
The second detentions, I was asked by the New Democracy Movement to join a rally and speak at the rally, and I refused because once you cross that line, you become an activist, of course. And I think if you become an activist in such manner, I think you have to leave your job. But of course, the nation asked me to resign the day after I was released from my second detention, so I didn't have to have trouble. And that's how I ended up at Council English today.
Okay, but you are dealing
หลัง
with
จาก
de
ถูก
facto
ปรับทัศนคติครั้งที่สอง เนชั่นก็ขอให้พี่ประวิตรลาออกตอนนี้ก็เลยทำงานอยู่กับข่าว Southern English
You have to be fair, and I am fair. I recall the Bangkok Post which interviewed me after my second detention, and somehow the story had some slight mistake describing the room as having no windows or something, and I wrote a letter to the Post back to the editor correcting that. I think we need to be fair. There's no hatred. This is just a matter of principle. We hope they understand that people who are critical of the literary regimes are not all Thaksin paid or red shirts. Well, I respect red shirts and Thaksin supporters, but the whole situation is much more complicated and complex than that.
Okay, just one final question. You've pushed yourself out. You're a target. You're a lightning rod. When do you feel you've done enough? You've made your point, but you don't have to go any further with personal sacrifice.
You know, I really wish I could just return to a very normal life, you know, as a reporter, or even quit the job and do.
คำถามก็คือว่าพี่ประวิตรจะทำไปถึงแค่ไหนนะคะในการต่อสู้
Given this situation, the fact that we don't even have our basic civil rights, I can't just sit idly. If you are in a position to be able to do
พี่ประวิต
something,
รก็บอกว่า
then
จ
you take
ริง
a
ๆก็อยา
step.
กจะใช้ชีวิตทำงานปกติธรรมดานะคะแต่สถานการณ์ตอนนี้มันก็เรายังถูกละเมิดอยู่
Okay, now I think we've got Maria Ressa speaking. Maria, can you hear me now? Yes, you can. Can we hear you? Can you make a noise? Can't hear you. I can see Ang Zo quite clearly. Can you hear me, Ang Zo? Yes, it's a very slow link. Right, it's still not working properly, so I'm going to carry on with Ed. Ed, we've just discussed what's happening to one particular journalist in Thailand. You have a much broader purview of the whole region. Can you give us a run through of what you believe is going on in terms of press freedom?
This year, I think the region has become very stupid.
Microphone's not working.
It's working.
Wake up on the desk then. Yeah, I think you're all right.
Okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So we have seen a lot of restriction in the region this year, particularly because the countries that are seen as freer, Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia, and Myanmar, have shown very clear signs of restrictions of press freedom. Thailand in particular, we're very concerned because the environment. Province case is probably just an example of what the entire community is experiencing. So, and we're actually very happy that he has received this award because it's a signal that there are times that journalists must take a stand, particularly to defend their job, their colleagues. Praveen is quite a high-profile speaker against the military regime and the restrictions of press freedom. But there are other journalists in Thailand who are facing basically the same task, the same situation. And it's important for that kind of work to be recognized. So probably Maria will be describing what's happening in the Philippines, but as a Filipino, we've always had this problem of impunity against journalists. We are the third or fourth, depending on the year, in terms of the number of journalists killed. Under President Duterte, there have been less journalists killed, 2, maybe, or 3, just since he came to power, but the threats that the journalists have been receiving for reporting what the government is doing about the drug war is really unprecedented. And then Indonesia, for example, there's still that anti-media attitude of the bureaucracy. Last year, there is an unprecedented 70 attacks against the media. Although thankfully no one is killed, it's higher than what they normally experience. And we guess that's a sign of also that the situation in Indonesia is not getting any better.
What about other countries in the region?
Well, if you look at the rankings, the RSF has this annual press freedom rankings, and Southeast Asia has been really performing very low. If you look at all the ranks last year, every country in Southeast Asia is in the bottom third, and that's not something that you can be proud of as a media community. And there are different reasons, but so apart from these countries that where
ถ้าพูดถึงเสรีภาพสื่อของทั้งโลกนะคะก็คือประเทศในเอเชียตะวันออกเฉียงใต้เนี่ยมีการได้รับการจัดลำดับที่ต่ำที่สุดในโลกอยู่แบบต่ำสุด3อันดับเนี่ยเป็นของ Southeast Asia ในเรื่องเสรีภาพสื่อ
publishers from establishing new newspapers because they're prevented by these laws. Vietnam, Laos, and Brunei have very strict. Basically, all media in these countries are state-owned or state-affiliated.
Right, and what about direct intervention? I mean, in Burma, for example, we've had 3 journalists arrested, sitting looking at jail time for basically doing their job, which is a very similar situation to the one that occurred with the Thai journalist a few months earlier, who was caught with pamphlets in his car, and he was called up as well.
Yeah. So in Burma, in Myanmar, the situation, particularly this year, is alarming, as there are now 5 cases against journalists. Many of them are charged under the telecommunications law for their Facebook posts related to their work. It is particularly
ตอนนี้ก็เล่าถึงตัวอย่างของสื่อที่พม่าที่มีการถูกละเมิดแล้วก็ถูกตั้งข้อหาเหมือนกัน
things to be better under the government of Aung San Suu Kyi. But then, if we look at the cases, especially telecommunications law, there are about 80 cases, and 10 of these are against affecting media people. And of these 80 cases, 75 were filed since April 2015, after the NLD took power, and it's just basically a law which anyone can use to target critics of the government or to get back at their enemies. But what is particularly alarming is that there seems to be this enough cases that you can say that this law is harming press freedom in Myanmar.
Right. Well, how are we doing with all part? So look, Sean, can you pop up on the microphone and give us a rundown on why Probably did give this prize?
ตอนนี้เดี๋ยวก็จะมีตัวแทนจากองค์กรที่ให้รางวัลกับพี่ประวิตรนะคะอธิบายว่าทำไมถึงได้ตัดสินใจมอบรางวัลให้ประวิตรโรจนพฤกษ์
Ringchai, is the microphone on? Is that mic on?
Yes.
It's good now.
Yeah. Okay. Every year I guess I should say an opening. I work as a journalist here in Bangkok and have since 1999. I'm currently with Asia Times Online as Southeast Asia editor. But for the last decade, I've also served as the Committee to Protect Journalists Southeast Asia representative. And in that role, I monitor press freedom conditions across all 11 Southeast Asian nations. Every year, the Committee to Protect Journalists, which is based in New York, it's a nonpartisan press freedom advocacy organization, looks across the world to award journalists for their courage in reporting and for those that have stood up to extraordinary instances of persecution and repression.
ทั่วโลกนะคะว่ามีสื่อคนไหนเนี่ยที่มีบทบาท
For my patch, in most years, one journalist of the 4 we award every year comes from Southeast Asia, which speaks to what Sipa said about just the poor press freedom conditions across the region, and it's been that way for a very long time. This year,
เราก็ดูสื่อที่ทำงานในสถานการณ์ที่ยากลำบากที่ถูกคุกคามเสรีภาพ
We've given to independent bloggers in Vietnam, which often face prison for their reporting. This year, we thought it was important to make the case that the press freedom situation in Thailand has deteriorated to such a degree under military rule.
สถานการณ์เสรีภาพสื่อของไทยเนี่ยมันตกต่ำมากๆนะคะ
That we looked for an emblematic reporter who has stood up to that military pressure. And
ก็เลยมองหาว่านักข่าวคนไหนที่มีบทบาทโดดเด่นในการทำหน้าที่
We cannot really find any other reporter in the country that stood up as strongly in their reporting, in their social media activities as Prawit has.
เราก็ได้เห็นว่าบทบาทของพี่ประวิตรนั้นโดดเด่นที่สุดนะคะในการทำงานแล้วก็ในการสื่อสารที่เป็นลักษณะของการไม่เกรงกลัวต่อเผด็จการ
on this extraordinary lèse-majesté crackdown, which a lot of the media wants to overlook and pretend isn't happening. People are being thrown in prison for the silliest things, for long prison sentences, for mere Facebook posts which insinuate some sort of criticism. We obviously would address the
.112 เนี่ยสื่อส่วนใหญ่ก็จะไม่กล้ารายงาน
But Prawit, in his reporting, I think, although Dominic asked, are you an activist reporter? I think if you look at his reporting on the crackdown, no one shot straight and as courageously on this extraordinary crackdown, which a lot of people in Thai society are looking the other way from. Prawit's put a light on it.
ในสถานการณ์ที่ใครๆเนี่ยหันหน้าหนีหรือว่าไม่รายงานเนี่ยคุณประวิตรก็ไปอยู่ตรงนั้นแล้วก็รายงานอย่างแข่งขันแล้วก็มีบทบาทที่โดดเด่น นั่นก็คือเหตุผลนะคะที่ได้ตัดสินใจมอบรางวัลให้กับคุณประวิตรค่ะ
Where's the award now?
How are we doing, John? So look, we have here a Filipino and a Thai journalist, and if you look back historically in Southeast Asia, these were the two bastions of the free press. The Philippines was courageous and colourful and exuberant, and Thailand had a very respectable press in the 1990s, but it was well funded. Starting with you, Prawit, how do you feel? We've talked about the slippery slope. How bad is the slippery slope in terms of the quality of journalism? Never mind.
นี่ก็เป็นคำถามเกี่ยวกับความรู้สึกของพี่ประวิตรนะคะเกี่ยวกับคุณภาพของสื่อไทยในตอนนี้
A good number of mainstream mass media do at least initially supported the coup. So there is that context that we must understand.
สื่อหลักส่วนใหญ่เนี่ยในช่วงแรกเนี่ยสนับสนุนรัฐประหารด้วยซ้ำไปนะคะด้วยความที่เราแบ่งเป็นขั้วการเมืองอย่างชัดเจน
outrightly call or support the 2014 coup, including actually the previous one back in 2006. So this sets a very strange
ในทุกครั้งที่มีรัฐประหารเนี่ยมันก็จะมีสื่อที่ไปสนับสนุนอยู่
people who would should otherwise be calling for more press freedom or defend press freedom, but in the end, not until this draft media reform bill or media control bill, did they manage to sort of try to get their act together? Before that, they were pretty much for the coup, and we're talking about at least half the mainstream media. You know, read the Bank of Laws and
ก่อนที่จะมีพรบควบคุมสื่อก็ไม่ได้เห็นการต่อต้านใดๆ
But again, we're not talking about this military regime being an elected government. You know, it used force to seize power, and that's a different. If they're happy with Prayut, I'm okay with that, but that's not the case. However, if you throw the arrow back in time much further, and we look at the time and the Thai media under strongmen like Field Marshal Sarit Thanarat, that's back in the 1960s, we would realize that the situation was much worse. Okay, now I'm trying to be nice to Prayut, am I? You know, journalists were literally thrown in prison and kept down for many months.
เล่าย้อนไปถึงประวัติศาสตร์ในช่วง
Politicians were executed using absolute power. Back then it used to be known as Article 17. Now it's Article 44. And actually, Article 44 was inspired by Article 17. So what I am saying is that despite all the difficulties and even despite the horrible charges that are being lashed against me, I still think that we have evolved, and we're not going back to the 1950s or the 60s. Probably we are taking a lot of back steps, you know, compared to the 90s. But that's just one side of the equation. You can't defend press freedom when the public are not respectful or appreciative of freedom of the press and freedom of expression. And again, we see that sort of divide within Thai society. A big chunk of dedicated Thais defending the less majestic law.
เสรีภาพสื่อได้ถ้าเกิดว่าสาธารณชนไม่ได้เห็นคุณค่าของเสรีภาพสื่อ
just leave the country, and then after they left the country, then they change their mind. Maybe Prayut wants them back to be prosecuted. So actually, we don't know what's happening. But we have to not just attain press freedom because it just doesn't exist in a vacuum, but we have to somehow foster a culture which is even beyond the media circle, a culture that is appreciative of freedom of expressions and press freedom. Unfortunately, even amongst those who are against Prayut, many of them can't take criticism themselves.
กับเสรีภาพในการแสดงออกไม่ใช่แค่เสรีภาพสื่อ
Maybe the 1990s, as you said, Dominic, was somehow artificial. Okay, the monarchy institution wasn't at a time when it would need to crack down, you know, where there would be a need to crack down on a lot of dissents. Okay, that things come as His Majesty, the late King ages, and there were more. You know, noises being made about the institution. So it comes with time, and we know what context we are, right? Now we are under Rama the 10th. What I'm going to say is that we are now dealing with what I would describe as less majestic plus, or LM plus, or 112 plus, which means there's an even greater level of self-censorship amongst the mainstream mass media and fear amongst the people. And yet, there's this social media, which is uncontrollable. You know, you read the reports about Prayut wanting to send people to convince YouTube or Facebook to, somehow get rid of remarks that are particularly against the monarchy institution, but that's a failure. So we're dealing with this new platform, which somehow bypassed the mainstream mass media, both Thai and English, which consistently censored itself. I do have to censor myself. A tough choice to make when it comes to reporting about the monarchy institution, because if you want to say something beyond that, probably you can only get away if you would take a one-way ticket. And a few have taken a one-way ticket. As we all know, at least 2 Thais have been announced by the military regime as being persona non grata.
อย่างไรก็ดีมันก็มีการเซ็นเซอร์ตัวเองอยู่นะคะโดยเฉพาะในการวิพากษ์วิจารณ์สถาบันหรือว่าการสื่อสารที่สุ่มเสี่ยงกับม.112 นะคะใครที่อยากจะพูดเนี่ยก็อาจจะต้องซื้อตั๋วเที่ยวเดียวออกไปนอกประเทศเลยอย่างเช่นอาจารย์สมศักดิ์แล้วก็อาจารย์ประวิน
Actually, that's just a hybrid thing. Perhaps it's the only organizations writing in Thai that is very critical, okay, on top of Prasha Thai, which is very critical and led to the detention of Jatupat Pai Dawdin, who all he did was to share the content of a controversial biography of the current king. And he has been sitting in prison for longer than half a year now, and there's no end. This is pre-trial detention of a man who eventually had to finish his class, undergraduate class in school. So the military regime was being dispatched to an undisclosed detention cell. One of the colonels told me, look, Rawit, if it was 20 to 30 years ago, it would be just a few thousand people reading what you write. Because of but now when you tweet, when you post something on Facebook, it just goes viral and they just don't know how to deal with it.
ว่าแต่ก่อนเนี้ยเวลารายงานข่าวอาจจะมีคนอ่านสัก1,000-2,000 คนแต่ว่าเดี๋ยวนี้พอส่งทวิตเตอร์ออกไปแล้วไม่รู้คนจะได้อ่านกี่คนมันควบคุมไม่ได้แล้วเขาก็ไม่รู้ว่าจะจัดการกับมันยังไง
My smartphone away, of course. Well, you can buy a new one whenever you have, and it's cheap. As we speak, some on social media is Facebook living what we are speaking to the Thai audience with some not simultaneous but occasional translation. So this is how far Thailand has evolved. This is part of the center, and they don't quite know what to do with this social media and all this talk, which is unheard of, prior to the era of social media. And we all know Thai, like Filipino, they are very addicted to social media. Facebook is really big here. Just like in the Philippines, Twitter is rapidly. My fear is that they might resort at the end to the Chinese model and simply just say we're going to just shut down Facebook and Twitter and create our own whatever.
ถ้าเกิดอยากจะควบคุมกันจริงๆก็ต้องไปใช้โมเดลแบบจีนนะคะแบนเฟซบุ๊กแล้วก็สร้างแพลตฟอร์มของตัวเองไปเลย
And we need tourists to be able to access Facebook and Twitter. If you're going to say there's no Twitter, Facebook or Twitter here, I think the tourists would go to Laos or Cambodia or elsewhere. So it's not a country that is big enough to have that muscle to just shut Facebook and Twitter away. And they're grappling with it, and I reckon this is one of the latest attempts, the charges against me has to do with Facebook posting, clearly it's sending a showing effect to other people. And I don't like it. Personally, I use my real name on both Facebook and Twitter, and I am always against people who use pseudonyms or fake names on Twitter or Facebook. But because of this fear, we see a lot of people who engage in critical discussions about the monarchy, about the military regime, using alias on Facebook or Twitter in Thailand, and yet they don't feel that free. I think they know that if the military regime want to hunt them down, they will. But then it's like a school of fish. People who read posting by Somsak, which is unfortunately in Thai, almost without exception in Thai. They're just many. Thai was amongst how many people? I think thousands who shared BBC Thai posting about the king's biography. And of course they pick the big fish or any figure that they believe would, as in what the Thai say, would be like an act that would slaughter a chicken in front of a monkey, and the monkey should learn the lesson and be quiet.
That's good stuff. Ricardo, going back to the Philippines, what is your perception of the way things have changed in the last 20 years vis-a-vis press freedom?
Well, the Philippines is, as one of our board members would say, a rambunctious press environment. And there's literally, we're the only country in the region that doesn't have a press law to protect or curtail press freedom. And that is quite a very vibrant scene if you're familiar with what happens in the Philippines. And I guess the other side of that is the constant, like we have 5 to 6 journalists a year being killed, 152 since 1986, since Marcos was ousted. And that presents a very real threat to journalists, especially those in the rural areas, particularly the radio journalists. This year, however, as I had said earlier, the threats to the media has changed. In terms of killing, there were less. In fairness to President Rodrigo Duterte, he established another task force to address the media killings. But on the other hand, journalists who have been reporting about human rights criticism of the regime's drug war and reporting of the drug war have been subject to unprecedented threats, like death threats, rape threats. It's really nothing like we have seen before. Unfortunately, it hasn't spilled over to actual physical violence. But then that's a very, say, insidious situation that it normalizes criticism of the media and lumps them and is basically against independent reporting on the drug war.
Right, but the situation you're describing where people are intimidated, vigilantes, and what we're seeing with the drug murders where we don't know who's doing the killing, that is a very different situation. Is the government connected to that kind of intimidation of the media, or is it business interests, or what?
Well, from our observation, we have seen the continuation of, because Duterte's his victory is attributed to a very successful social media campaign, which is partly really popular and partly created, manufactured in terms of bots. And so this social media campaign has continued even beyond the campain. And there's an indication that it's still being it's partly manufactured, but the real danger to this is that people who wouldn't ordinarily be making death threats to other people are doing so now just to show their support to the presidency. So I guess it needs to be studied how this is happening more clearly. I hope we are able to get Maria Ressa, because the Rappler is at the receiving end of one of the most vicious campaigns, particularly the journalists for their reports on the extrajudicial killings.
On that note, Jonathan, do we have it's fine. Are we going to get her or not?
No.
Well, have you wiped it? You trying for Anzoy? Alright, on that note, we have a microphone in the bigger room, so there are lots of people who'd like to contribute and ask a question. Please join us.
No, this isn't a hurry.
Just for curiosity, I don't think
there technical problems, which obviously not going to get resolved today. In fact, the question I wanted to ask to both Praveen and Ed relates to what Maria Ressa would have talked about had we managed to get her up. It's just referred to what Rappler's been doing. Journalists in the Philippines have come under intense, organised social media attacks. Now, Private's talked today a lot about the way that he uses social media for getting the message out. And in Thailand, social media has been a way in which information has been spread very effectively that the government can't control. And attempts for the government to control it have been quite ineffective. In the Philippines, we've seen something else, which is a very effective use of social media actually to harass established media. Some ways challenging them on justified grounds that the established media have always been part of business conglomerates and have vested interests. But there are massive numbers of fake news accounts in the Philippines. There's a huge amount of manipulation, and certainly the pressure that Maria, I know, has been subject to has been very, very intense. And I want your own views on how you see social media being used, because obviously in the United States and in Europe, particularly in the US with Trump, we've seen social media become quite a negative force in terms of just the dissemination of false information. Are we also seeing that in other parts of Southeast Asia outside of the Philippines?
Thanks, Jonathan. I hope that we will not abandon social media to the worst of the users. You know, it's relatively new. It's full of hate speech, but that's not the only side of social media. You know, the color-coded hate speech continues more than 3 years after the coup. If anyone could read Thai, just follow a few sample big Twitter user on both sides and you would see that. Having said that, as I have mentioned earlier, this is a new public sphere, a place of hope that perhaps we could reasonably learn from the other, exchange views. Somehow, it's still a project in the making, but I am still hopeful. My stand is I do not block people of different views, okay? If someone reminded that I may have accidentally blocked, then I unblock. I try to learn from them, even from their hate speech. You understand the sort of paranoia and fear some of these people have against Thaksin or Yingluck or those who think differently about the less majestic law, for example. So let us not give up social media to the trolls, okay, and try to be very calm and measured in blocking. Otherwise, blocking others who think differently. Otherwise, we ended up in a ghetto. Facebook is a good example. People only friending people who think alike, and they ended up in their own world with starkly different views of Taiwan. All right. So this is the challenge. The context of Thai society in which social media is increasingly part of, because everyone carries, smartphones and they keep on checking their Facebook or Twitter every now and then, and I'm a bit guilty of that. But we just have to learn to cultivate this tolerance and respect for different views, and this would be the foundation for the respect for press freedom. I can't see any other way. It is a cause for hope. Of course, it's like a knife. You can use it for good or bad. It depends on how you use it, and hopefully we will be able to learn to exchange civilly, accept different view, and not get too angry about people who think differently about Prayut, about monarchy, or about Yingluck. Thank you.
What's your own sense about the Thai authorities' attempts to control social media?
As I said, they are very alarmed. Both detentions partly has to do with social media. They talked about it. Actually, during the first detention, one colonel said, while I was in the camp in Ratchaburi, we have learned all the mistakes of the previous coup. So this time it will be different. It was a reference to the 2006 coup. And I told him, almost automatically, I'm sorry, there's one thing you could have never prepared yourself for, and that's social media. Okay, for issues like the monarchy institution, social media have surpassed the mainstream mass media, or even rendered the mainstream mass media to becoming increasingly irrelevant. Of course, there's all fake news and all this false information on social media. But my point is, I think we just have to learn to be mature and to know how to use it wisely. The answer is not in blocking them. They are very concerned. They don't know what to do. Jonathan, they try to talk to Google, to Facebook, and there's been news report about that. And of course, it's been unsuccessful, all right? And that's their cause for concern. So they arrest.
What's interesting is that in the Philippines, Duterte has successfully harnessed social media to actually disable his opponents. Is it all that the Thai authorities don't seem to be able to do that? Perhaps it's a function of being a military government. We haven't seen that level of sophisticated social media manipulation here.
Don't tell that to Prayut. He might go to Manila to learn something from Duterte. Thank you.
Well, maybe you could give us some tips. encouraging.
Yeah, probably should be teaching us all lessons about how to use social media properly. But I guess that point about Jonathan, some sectors have used social media more effectively than others, and often using dubious means, like the employment of bots. You see that generation of support and likes and echoing of messages of the main social media commanders, for example, to support Duterte. So there is that. But as SIPA, what we are really concerned is that, as we alluded to, the governments across the region have reacted to this phenomenon, which presents very good possibilities in terms of citizens' participation, with extreme paranoia. What we have seen in the past maybe 5 years is the translation of restriction, free speech restrictions, offline to online. So you now have defamation, you now have espionage, you now have Computer Crimes Act, which are not really about technical crimes, but really enabling the authorities to punish what is expressed over social media, and that's really very concerning. In Thailand, for example, what we are really very concerned about is the comprehensive approach of the regime to control media, broadcast media, social media, and mainstream media, to push back what the Thai public has taken for granted in the past maybe 20-25 years of media. And new laws are being set up that enable any power that be to use against critics, and that's really very something that we should be concerned about.
Just before Tony comes, how many followers do you have on Facebook?
I started with Twitter, so with Twitter it's 34K, almost 35 now, 34.9. On Facebook, I believe something like 24,000.
So it is quite big, but it's not the circulation of the nation yet.
Yeah,
the alleged circulation.
The alleged. No, the thing is, that's what they call social network. When people share, you could have someone with even more followers retweeting or sharing your posting, and that's what it counts.
Like Yingluck, who has 6 million.
Well, and 1,000 showed up yesterday.
Okay, Tina.
Tina from House of English. I have a question for Rohit. Congrats for the award today, and thanks for everyone joining us today to go on the issue today. Rohit, you're a journalist and you're also a person who freely expresses his opinion on Facebook, on social media. As we said, well, how do you reconcile the two roles when you work in journalism, a profession that some say requires you to be sort of like impartial agents, detached, of the political stage and all that, and on the other hand, you're also very passionate, person who speaks about these issues on social media. And I understand there's debates going on right now, especially after Trump victory in the US. What's the line boundary that journalists should be, how it should be? Either like as impartial, neutral, detached agents of truth. And I understand, how editor thought he's that kind of person. It's really journalism and his opinion and all. On the other hand, you also have people believe journalists should do more than just reporting facts. You should also, express that stance and, take up issues. What's your consideration on this?
Thanks, Tony. There's no clear line. As you know, journalists, even amongst journalists, there are different views as to how to approach a proper story. Do you have to always call the other side, or would you do an in-depth interview on just one side in a more empathetic way, But again, having said that, I always try to be very fair to the other side. So Prayut, I don't hate Prayut. This is not a matter of hating him or General Prayut, despite what they have done to me. This is a matter of principle. Okay, you're just trying to defend press freedom, but you can't even function if you don't have press freedom. So we are now in an extraordinary situation, and as I have said earlier, I wish I could return to be my normal Prayut. The pre-coup life would be much simpler, but that ain't happening anytime soon. And you can't do a proper job if you can't defend press freedom, because increasingly, and you know, Tony, the military regime sent all sorts of signals through many ways to pressure us not to write this or that story. That's happening every day, and the public are not being even properly informed. Actually, at Council English, that's one of the pride, if I may advertise, councilenglish.com. You know, when we run into troubles of having to censor stuff about the monarchy, we try to make it a point and note it in the story that this story is subject to censorship. So I try my best, and you know, there's a slight difference between being impartial and being fair. I am fair. I can never be impartial between, you know, between dictatorship and freedom, but I am fair to Prayut. I would never slander him, use abusive word, or cook anything that I think is doesn't merit. You know, the thing, just take the case of Koti, this guy who have allegedly been just abducted in Laos and believed to be enforced discipline. We still do not know the truth. Unless I see concrete evidence, I'm not going to conclude that it was the handiworks of the military regime. You know, but thanks for your question, Tony, and thanks for thanking me.
I'm going to hold the questions. I think we've now got Ong Zaw in Rangoon, finally. Is he on the screen or not? Ong Zaw, can you hear me? I'm lip reading you. Come on, guys.
Just a suggestion, why don't you just have her call on the phone, put her picture up, and have her talk. I mean, I don't want to come up with an extreme idea, but yeah, seems pretty simple.
Roger, can I hear you?
Use your smartphone, right?
I can hear Roger in the background. This isn't amazing. This is the press club. We know all about technology.
Stupid smartphone, call up, put a picture up, and tell us, say what you want. Come on.
Alright, so, Jonathan, ask a question.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Miller from Channel 4 News. It's not so much a question. I think I share everyone's disappointment in not being able to see Ong Zaw or Maria Ressa tonight yet. But I wanted to just share my experience briefly of having worked in the Philippines quite a lot this year, and I've been up and down between Manila and Davao, and talk to you about what Maria Ressa's publication, Rappler, has done. In the President's State of the Nation address just last week, he name-checked Rappler and a television station called ABS-CBN. And this is part of his own intimidation against the media. He sort of took a sideswipe at them. In fact, wrongly said that Rappler was foreign-owned, which was apparently his issue with them. But Rappler has been incredibly brave in its reporting. Rappler has been incredibly brave in its reporting, and again I've been to news conferences with Duterte, in which Rappler journalists have asked difficult questions and put to him, along with other journalists, really challenging questions about what's happening, particularly in his war on drugs, but also about his plans for martial law. And I think we should, the respect that we should have for these publications standing up against what I think is the making of the dictator in the Philippines. It knows no bounds. This is a culture where if you travel to Davao, where there is a seemingly healthy press, this is the president's home city of which he was mayor for 23 years. They have a culture there, as explained to me by one newspaper editor, of what they call envelopmental journalism. By this he meant little brown envelopes, which were passed to journalists to buy their loyalty. This has worked in Port Duterte, in Davao, through the 2 decades or more in which he ruled with an iron fist and ran death squads and kept the press quiet. He is now replicating exactly what he did in Davao as president. The press there in Manila, nationwide, is under threat like never before. And while you're right in saying that they haven't killed journalists over the past year, I sense that the noose is tightening. And it's not only journalists, but human rights workers, lawyers, priests, those who speak out and criticize the China, that is war on drugs, have come in for extreme intimidation and, as you said before, death threats. I think many have received death threats. And I think we've got to keep a really close look at what's happening to those people. This is dangerous. And while no one's been killed just yet, journalists have been killed just yet, many others have. And it won't be long. No question particularly.
Okay, is Anzola, can you get him up? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
We've got your voice. Yeah. I'm sorry for all the mess that's gone on this evening. You started your journalistic career in Thailand because of the lack of freedom of speech in Burma, and today you're back in Rangoon, Yangon, and there's a new era in journalism, but you have concerns once more. Maybe you can discuss them with us. Did he hear anything I said? You can't go on like this. Okay, he didn't. Can we have questions, please? Questions from the floor? There he is, but I don't think he can hear us. Hi, thanks.
Hi, I'm Lisa from NFK. I have a question for P. Pravit. It's like, as a young journalist, and I look up to you and a lot of other journalists who have been writing against junta and the messages they all. So, my question is, how far would you go to discuss about the junta messages, and what advice we have for young journalists who wish to make changes in life?
So the question is, what advice would you give a young journalist who wants to bring change to Thailand?
Yeah, and also how far would you go to discuss about the issue?
I think he's answered that pretty much, but what would be your advice to a young journalist?
First of all, if you see journalism more than a job, a vocation, a calling, then I think you're in a good state. Okay? You need to have a higher goal. But when I say need, it's either exists or doesn't exist. Okay? If journalism is just another job, I'm doubtful if you become great 10 or 20 years down the road. But if you fully love it, okay, at least if you really love it, keep focused. I would wish to see more Thai journalists at least develop an expertise in at least one area. They have to be a jack of all trades. And I think also is back today. Okay, also please.
Amzor, can you hear us now? Amzor, it's Dominic.
Not so clear.
Alright, we can hear you, so you just tell us what the situation is in Rangoon at the moment. I've already introduced you, so just tell us what's going on there.
Situation now in Rangoon with India. Well, thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Bravo.
Sorry that I couldn't be there in person. Well, I think I would like to congratulate Pravit. I think I want to also say that we're on the same boat now. Because if you look at Thailand, last 20 years, it served as a beacon of hope for press freedom and democracy, where we used to live and operate from Thailand and inform what is going on in Myanmar and Burma. And now it seems to be the space is getting tight with these priests. And we will go back to we were allowed to go back to Burma. There was a happy days 5 years ago, but that day is gone. And now is the old days of
climate of fear, uncertainty, the self-censorship, all things has been, I think, coming back to us, and unfortunately, and as you have seen that our reporter and two reporters from Democratic Party of Burma, they have been prevented because of they were in a conflict zone. They were just doing their jobs, reporting the conflict situation as a normal journalist, reporter jobs as you do everywhere in Iraq, Afghanistan, or Thailand, or the South, wherever you are, in Vietnam, or in Philippines, or Indonesia, or Malaysia. But they've been prevented with the charge with the Unlawful Association Act, which was practiced under the British, and it was Draconian Act, which has been attempted to arrest the people who would be deemed to be suspect or collaborator to the other side. So this law has been brought out of closet to charge the reporters, as well as the infamous 1660, which has been kind of a computer crimes act like in Thailand, but now it has been used in Thailand, in Myanmar and Burma to arrest and detain and active reporters and journalists and editors. It is supposed to protect, the law is supposed to protect the civilians and activists or social media, active social media user. It's supposed to protect the people, but it's now used against those of us and media people, media personnel, and reporters, editor, and put us in prison. We couldn't even get a bill. It criminalized the information, and it put people in prison and without bail. So this now we are under the elected civilian governments led by Aung San Suu Kyi and other Democrats. But you can clearly see that we are going in the wrong direction, and you can clearly see that within 1 or 2 years under this administration, the obvious backsliding, the return of climate of fear, there's a widespread self-censorship notice. Even as I now to you, we are not even sure what is happening to us tomorrow as I speak now, because of how much power, how much space, how much limitation, or what is the barrier, or what is the drawing line, we are not even sure now. And to describe our situation, I mean, the fourth estate, which is supposed to solve a stronger pillar of the democratic society in any country. So I think this is a very brief situation that we have. But last week there was a very interesting development. Because of the detention of our reporter and journalist, it has been, thanks to CPJ, RSF, and everyone who've been raising the issues, covering the issues, it has been quite persistent in terms of getting the attention and everywhere. So I think military and Ministry of Information, they came out before the some kind of a joint meeting, and the military spokesperson came out and said that he said we won't interfere in a judicial matter. It meaning that they won't pressure the judicial process, because where in northern part of Burma, in Shan State, our reporter and DVD reporters, 2 of them, with other driver and other civilians who accompanied them during the trip were prevented and detained. So the military, this first time they came out to say that we won't interfere in a judiciary matter, which is maybe. There's a maybe that there's small impact and small glimmer of hope, But because of this coming Friday, there will be another trial, open trial for our reporters. And if that is going to be transparent, if there is no people from upstairs into, pressure, and they are daily, a very small chance that we might be granted bail. That is going to be I would say, in scale of Burma, in the case of Burma, that would be very interesting format. So we don't know yet that how court proceeding will proceed, and when as we speak to or spoke to communication with the local people and the law firms, lawyers, and there is definitely a worry. They worry that they don't act independently. They cannot act independently. They know that if they even wanted to build it out, they don't know what kind of impact will come to them, or what kind of thing will backfire on them. And also to keep in mind that this area in northern part, there has been ongoing conflict. Fighting has been very consistent between the troops, the Burmese army forces, and also rebel and insurgent forces. So I think there is also fear that because there was a bomb attack to the police station where our reporters are briefly detained. So if even the judge or any lawyer, if they started to be politicizing the issue, if they start to speak, if they take a daring step, they worry that not just the military or government, but also there's other side of the element, which is, they will come out and do something. So I think this is under pressure from both sides. For us as a journalist, in 2012, we went back to Burma. We were happy to go home, full of optimism, but we were not naive. We were very cautious that things could get nasty and then ugly. And we have seen it. We've seen it in 2014, 2013, ahead of the election, the rise of radical nationalist movement and a lot of conflicts and criminal rights. We have covered free. But now, the space seems to be, the army and this civilian government, space seems to be tighter. And we don't,
No, we haven't said anything. We're listening to you, Georgie.
I should stop, but I'm saying we're not even sure now under this government dealing with the two governments, two authorities, or who is commanding the ship, who is commanding the boat. We are not even sure in this kind of and the Burma issue has been overshadowed. Everywhere, Obama Air Force landed to Burma twice, and everyone comes to trade Burma. Now, if you look at where we are today, we are almost back to square one. That's what I want to say.
Okay, that's a very gloomy assessment. What are your own plans for running the Irrawaddy? You're dividing your time between Chiang Mai and Rangoon. What are your plans?
How it's moving forward. Just also slightly to the left.
The Irrawaddy was a monthly magazine which was
the question came first. Please wait a second.
What are your plans as the editor of the Irrawaddy and how the Irrawaddy is going to move forward in this climate?
Well, I think everyone's those media practitioners inside the country. I think those very few even by the journalists and reporters. But still, there are the large number of inspiring reporters, and they are worried, and they worry about what they can write in case something happens. That we all think about contingency plan. We have to think of what if something happens. Ahead of 2020, there's a sign that things are going to get worse and worse. And if you look around the region, if you look around once, the country that used to be speaking up Burma under the Trump administration, what is happening over there is that, every day, every night, you switch on the TV, you look at the clowns in CNN. So I think you can see that everywhere it seems things are going really upside down.
Okay, it's too strenuous to do a Q&A. Also, thank you very much for talking to us. I'm sorry it was so troublesome. I want to go back to this muddle between journalism and social media, because we're always chasing our tails on this. There was a very interesting development yesterday in Indonesia where the managing director of Telegram was called in to meet the communications minister, and he was told, we have a very serious problem in this country with your service, and that is it's being used by an Islamic State. And they were particularly concerned about something called supergroups, which gives you the facility to talk to 10,000 people. And this chap, Pavel, I think his name is, was quite obliging, and he said, well, yes, we'll do something about it in the public areas. But what we can't do anything about is the encrypted communications, which is what social media is really all about. So this is all the people talking to each other in private conversations that none of us have any idea about. In Thailand, we have Telegram, but it's Line that is the big feeder, and there's just huge amounts of material going around about us, about you, about Jonathan, about everybody. Everybody's a victim. What do you say though to a government that has a very legitimate concern about terrorism? They have implicated Telegram in 17 attacks, including the Sumatra bus station and the murder of the policeman and what have you. What do you say? I mean, the government's job is to protect the peace, and yet this is not a free speech debate, is it?
It is unfortunate that the Indonesian government has stated that it will be curtailing Telegram, although they have seemed to be backtracking a bit.
They didn't curtail it.
For a total ban, so they just threatened and then. Our worry is that this security concern, which is very legitimate in certain context, is being conflated with the public's access and use of these technologies, which provides a sort of protection against state monitoring and surveillance. We suggest that the work it should be done separately. The police work to curtail against terrorists should be improved, and it should. That's the thing. It's inherent in the technology that this can be used, but to conflate the need for privacy and the protection against surveillance with the police concern about the use of terrorist groups is quite dangerous.
Well, I think security issues need to also be accountable to the public, or at least there should be a proper check and balance that it will not be abused. The anti-junta movement here, some people are wondering to what extent they could check our phone conversation, for example. I don't know about that, but in terms of the location, I could tell you for sure, because when they took me in for the second time around, before they let me go after day 3, one of the general me what I was doing at 2 locations, and clearly they could only have learned about it from tracing the phone. All right. In this sort of situation where the government is not really accountable to anyone, and there's no check and balance, we have a rubber stamp parliament, the police totally under the military regime. I would be very concerned. But again, technology change, this is an evolving thing. There will always be debate about privacy and concern for security. Sadly, we all know the Thai military is a state within a state. Even before the coup, it has always been for many decades. Even during elected administrations. And we could see that from the fact that any elected administrations are always very sensitive when it comes to military reshuffle, or the fact that in Thailand the power traditionally rests not on the supreme commander but the army chief. So this says a lot about the situation. So I'm very concerned. We are seeing more security issues being entrenched within the military, taken away from other bodies, and this is a concern. But again, Thailand doesn't have that serious IS issues as yet, or at least compared to countries like Indonesia or the Philippines. So for here, I think there are more concerns about wanting to know what people talk about the king on social media.
Are there any questions? I don't want to get to... Oh, sorry, there was a question.
So, just a quick question, a technical one. You mentioned Telegram and Line. VPN generally, how safe is it and how secure is it in, say, the Philippines, Burma and Thailand? How much can we rely on it, or how much are they breaking into it? I know from being in China, it was frequently they break into it, it'd fail, and then the VPN provider would get onto my computer and sort it out again. How much can we rely on it?
I'm not a technical person, but I guess what we are concerned as Filipinos is that our president's spokesman has repeatedly said, if you're a law-abiding citizen, then you shouldn't be concerned about martial law. And that's precisely the danger of this how for example, the opening up encrypted channels of communication and the attack on civil liberties are related. No? If you're normalizing surveillance, if you're normalizing human rights violations, curtailment of free speech, you're sending a signal that things are not open to debate, and that undermines the whole democratic system that people have fought for to establish. And it's really there's no way to how do you say that? Well, I'll just stop there.
If you were talking about lèse-majesté, I don't want to get too wrapped up in the lèse-majesté debate, but if you go back over the century, the Thai law of lèse-majesté is the most extreme since the German Empire, the Kaiser, entered the 19th century. Even not quite as extreme as what was seen in Japan in the Second World War. Now, if you go back to Germany at that time, I think they ended up with something like 6,000 people in jail for crimes of lèse-majesté, and suddenly the whole thing just collapsed. It became completely unmanageable, and the Kaiser released them all. Am I correct? The German cultural attache is wobbling. But anyway, basically it was just abandoned. We're moving into a period of celebrations and special events. And in Thailand there's a tradition of amnesties and pardons and other things. Have you heard anything on the grapevine that there may be something in the offing to diffuse this situation where you have people being accused of slandering kings who didn't exist and that kind of thing?
There's always a speculations about this, But again, this is a royal prerogative, and so I'm not really in a position to say beyond the fact that there is some expectation and speculation as well. Although I could quote people like Kun Ekachai, Hong Kang-wan, a former less majestic detainee himself, and he's now out and assisting those who are still behind bars. And he said he's not very hopeful. He thinks that is unlikely. But we'll just have to wait and see. All right.
So we could be pessimistic. Right. Well, it's been a hell of an evening for technology, and I can only apologise for it. We will sort this out, and I'm not clear what happened, but we finally got Hangzhou on a very bad connection. The good news, of course, is that Maria Ressa will be talking to us, and we will have another programme on this subject at some time in the not too distant future. So on that note, thank you Hangzhou in cyberspace, and thank you Prawit, and thank you Ed for coming.
โอเคเดี๋ยวอีกสักครู่หนึ่งจะกลับมาคุยกับพี่ประวิตรในไลฟ์ถัด